Welcome back, my dear listener. Tonight, we'll be exploring the complete history of House of the Dragon, a story that begins during the golden age of House Targaryen, a time when dragons still filled the skies, when the Iron Throne was stronger than ever before, and when few people could imagine that such a powerful family would one day turn against itself. Over the course of tonight's journey, we'll follow kings and queens, princes and princesses, dragons, battles, alliances, and betrayals. We'll see how a disagreement over succession slowly grew into a devastating civil war, a conflict that would become known as the Dance of the Dragons. And by the end of our story, we'll understand how one of the most powerful dynasties in the history of Westeros began its long decline. So close your eyes, if you'd like. Take a slow, comfortable breath, and let's travel back together to a world of dragons, fire, and blood to understand how this story began. We first need to travel back nearly 200 years before the events of Game of Thrones. At that time, House Targaryen stood at the very peak of its power. For generations, the Targaryens had ruled the 7 kingdoms from the Iron Throne. Unlike every other noble family, they possessed something no one else had: dragons. Massive creatures of fire and flight, powerful enough to burn entire armies and terrifying enough to keep rebellions from ever beginning. The Targaryens had originally come from old Valyria, a great civilization that existed across the narrow sea. Valyria was known for its wealth, its magic, and above all, its dragons. But centuries earlier, that mighty empire had been destroyed in a catastrophic event known as the Doom of Valyria. Almost overnight, the greatest civilization in the known world vanished. Cities disappeared, mountains erupted, and millions of people were lost. Yet one family survived: House Targaryen. Having left Valyria before the disaster, they settled on the island of Dragonstone, and from there, they would eventually conquer Westeros. Led by Aegon the Conqueror and his sister queens, the Targaryens united the 7 kingdoms through fire, blood, and dragons. For nearly a century afterward, their rule remained secure. Kings came and went. Children were born. Generations passed. And the dragons continued to fill the skies. To many people, it seemed as though the Targaryen dynasty would last forever. But history often changes when people become too comfortable. And as our story begins, a new king sits upon the Iron Throne. A king whose decisions would shape the fate of his family, his kingdom, and every dragon yet to come. His name was Viserys Targaryen. Viserys Targaryen was not the kind of king who dreamed of war. He was not known for great battles, nor was he feared like some rulers who came before him. Instead, Viserys was remembered as a peaceful man, a king who preferred harmony over conflict, feasts over fighting, and family over politics. When Viserys inherited the Iron Throne, the realm was prosperous. The 7 kingdoms had enjoyed years of stability. Trade flourished, the harvests were plentiful, and the dragons of House Targaryen were more numerous than they had been in generations. For many people, this seemed like a golden age. Yet even during the most peaceful times, problems can grow quietly. And for Viserys, the greatest problem was succession. The question of who would rule after him. His wife, Queen Aemma Arryn, had suffered through many difficult pregnancies. Some children were stillborn, others survived only briefly. Each loss weighed heavily upon the king and queen, yet both continued to hope for a son, a male heir who would secure the future of their dynasty. Then, after years of waiting, the moment finally arrived. Queen Aemma was once again pregnant, and throughout the kingdom, many believed the long-awaited prince had finally come. The king himself allowed his hopes to grow. He imagined a future where his son would inherit the throne, where the line of succession would be unquestioned, where peace would continue. But history rarely follows the plans people make. The birth that followed would become one of the most tragic moments in Viserys' life, a moment that would leave him heartbroken, a moment that would change the future of House Targaryen, and a moment whose consequences would echo for generations, because after that day, the king would be forced to make a decision about inheritance, a decision about power, and a decision that would eventually divide his family into 2 rival sides. The dance of the dragons had not yet begun, but the first stones were already being placed. The day finally arrived, and all across the Red Keep, people waited anxiously for news. King Viserys waited as well, certain that soon he would finally have the son he had always wanted, a prince, an heir, the future of House Targaryen. But behind the doors of the Queen's chamber, the situation was becoming desperate. Queen Aemma was struggling. The birth was difficult, far more difficult than anyone had expected. The Meisters realized that a terrible choice had to be made. Either the queen or the child. Both could not be saved. Viserys was forced to decide, and it was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The king chose to try to save the child. Queen Ema Arryn died during childbirth, and the son for whom so much had been sacrificed survived only briefly. The infant prince, Balon Targaryen, lived for just a few hours before he too passed away. In a single day, Viserys lost his wife, his newborn son, and the future he had imagined for so many years. The king was devastated. The court mourned. And throughout the kingdom, the celebrations that had been prepared were replaced with silence. Now, the Iron Throne had no clear male heir. And once again, the question of succession returned. Who would rule after Viserys? Many believed the answer should be Prince Daemon Targaryen, the king's younger brother, a skilled warrior, a fearless dragon rider, and one of the most dangerous men in Westeros. Daemon was charismatic, confident, and unpredictable. Some admired him, others feared him, but almost everyone agreed on one thing. Daemon wanted power, yet Viserys did not fully trust his brother. The relationship between the two men had always been complicated. They loved each other as brothers, but they rarely agreed. And after the death of Queen Ema and Prince Balon, those tensions began to grow. Then, a rumor reached the king. A story claiming that Daemon had mocked the death of the infant prince. Whether the story was completely true or not, it deeply wounded Viserys. The king's grief quickly turned to anger, and in that moment, he made a decision that would change the history of House Targaryen forever. Instead of naming Daemon as his heir, Viserys chose someone else. His only surviving child, his daughter, Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen. For the first time, a woman stood at the center of the line of succession. And although many nobles swore loyalty to the young princess, not everyone accepted the decision. Some remained silent, some openly disagreed, and others simply waited. Because in Westeros, tradition carried great weight, and many believed that sooner or later, the question of who should inherit the Iron Throne would return once again. They were right. Following the death of Queen Ema and the loss of his infant son, King Viserys officially named Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen as his heir. It was an extraordinary decision, one that surprised many throughout the Seven Kingdoms. For generations, the Iron Throne had passed from king to son. And although women of House Targaryen had held influence before, none had ever been chosen to rule the realm in their own name. Yet Viserys remained firm. Rhaenyra was his daughter, his only living child, and and in his eyes, she was the rightful heir. Soon, the great lords of Westeros were summoned. One by one, they knelt before the young princess, and one by one, they swore sacred oaths to honor her claim to the Iron Throne. For a time, it appeared that the matter had been settled. Rhaenyra grew up within the Red Keep, surrounded by nobles, servants, knights, and dragons. She attended meetings of the small council. She listened to discussions of law, trade, and war. And slowly, she began preparing for the day she would become queen. As a young girl, Rhaenyra was intelligent, confident, and determined. She possessed the unmistakable pride of House Targaryen, and she understood that one day the future of the realm might rest upon her shoulders. At her side was her closest friend, a Lysant Hightower, the daughter of Sir Otto Hightower, the king's hand. The two girls spent much of their time together. They read books, shared stories, walked through the halls of the Red Keep, and for a while, their friendship seemed unbreakable. Neither of them could have imagined how dramatically their lives would change. Because while Rhaenyra was preparing to become heir, others at court were already thinking about the future. Among them was Otto Hightower, a careful and highly intelligent man. Unlike Daemon, Otto rarely used force. His weapon was influence, patience, and political skill. He understood that power was often won through quiet conversations rather than swords. As the years passed, the king remained unmarried, and many began to wonder whether Viserys would choose a new queen. At first, this seemed like a personal matter, but in reality, it was a question that could determine the future of the entire kingdom. Because if the king had more children, especially sons, many people would begin to question whether Rhaenyra should remain heir. And before long, that possibility would become reality. A marriage was approaching. A marriage that would divide friendships, create rival factions, and plant the seeds of a devastating war. The dance of the dragons was still years away, but the path toward it had already begun. As the months passed, pressure began to grow around King Viserys. The realm needed stability. The great houses wanted certainty, and many believed the king should marry again. A new queen could provide more heirs and secure the future of House Targaryen. Several noble families hoped to gain influence through such a marriage. Among them was House Velaryon, one of the richest and most powerful families in Westeros. Lord Corlys Velaryon, known as the Sea Snake, proposed a match between Viserys and his young daughter, Lena Velaryon. From a political perspective, it was an excellent choice. The alliance would unite two powerful Valyrian families. It would strengthen the crown, and it would repair tensions that had begun to grow between the king and House Velaryon. Many expected Viserys to accept, but the king had other plans. While the court debated politics and alliances, another relationship was quietly developing. Following the death of Queen Aemma, Alicent Hightower had spent many evenings in the king's company. She listened to his worries, spoke with him gently, and offered comfort during a time of great grief. Viserys appreciated her kindness, and over time, the two grew closer. Then came the announcement. King Viserys declared that he would marry Alicent Hightower. The decision shocked much of the court. It surprised Lord Corlys. It angered many members of House Velaryon. And perhaps most importantly, it devastated Princess Rhaenyra. Alicent had been her closest friend, someone she trusted, someone she believed would always stand beside her. Now, Alicent would become her stepmother, and one day, the Queen of Westeros. The friendship between the two young women began to change, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, like a crack forming in stone. At first, it was almost invisible, yet with each passing year it grew larger. Soon, Queen Alicent gave birth to a healthy son. The child was named Aegon Targaryen. For many people, this changed everything. A male heir now existed, a son of the king, and throughout Westeros, questions immediately arose. If the king now had a son, should Rhaenyra still inherit the throne? Or should Aegon take her place? Viserys refused to change his decision. Again and again, he insisted that Rhaenyra remained his chosen heir. But not everyone agreed. Some nobles continued to support the princess. Others quietly shifted their loyalty toward the young prince. Without realizing it, the court had begun to divide. Two different futures were taking shape, two competing claims, two groups of supporters. And one day, those divisions would erupt into open war. For now, the children were still young. The dragons still flew, and peace still remained. But beneath the surface, the first true factions of the Dance of the Dragons were beginning to form. As the years passed, the royal family continued to grow. Queen Alicent gave birth to more children. First came Aemond, then Daeron, and a daughter, Helena. Together, they formed a new branch of House Targaryen, a branch that many believed should one day rule the Seven Kingdoms. Meanwhile, Princess Rhaenyra remained the king's official heir. She was growing older now, no longer a child, but a young woman whose future was being watched closely by the entire realm. Every decision she made became the subject of discussion. Every friendship, every disagreement, every rumor. At court, appearances mattered. And for an heir to the Iron Throne, they mattered more than ever. King Viserys continued to defend his daughter, yet maintaining peace between the different sides was becoming more difficult. The relationship between Rhaenyra and Queen Alicent grew colder with each passing year. The friendship they had once shared was slowly disappearing. In its place came distrust, resentment, and competing ambitions. At the center of many conflicts stood Prince Daemon Targaryen, the king's brother, a man who remained as fascinating as he was dangerous. Daemon spent years moving between the court, the battlefield, and the free cities across the narrow sea. He fought wars, won victories, lost influence, and gained it again. No matter how far he traveled, he always seemed to return to the center of Targaryen politics. Many viewed him as reckless. Others admired his courage. But almost everyone agreed that Daemon could never be ignored. Then, another major event shook the royal family. After years of political discussion, Princess Rhaenyra was married to Laenor Velaryon, the son of Lord Corlys Velaryon and Princess Rhaenys. The marriage was designed to strengthen alliances and unite two powerful houses. On paper, it was a perfect match. Yet reality was often more complicated. Despite the marriage, rumors soon began to spread throughout the kingdom. Rumors concerning Rhaenyra's children. Rumors questioning their parentage. Rumors that would create even greater tensions between the supporters of Rhaenyra and the supporters of Alicent's children. These whispers moved through castles, towns, and noble courts. And while few dared speak openly, many listened, many judged, and many chose sides. The king tried desperately to preserve unity. He wanted peace within his family, peace within the realm, and peace for the future. But with every passing year, that goal seemed further away. Because the problem was no longer a simple question of succession. It had become a struggle between two rival branches of the same family. A struggle fueled by pride, by suspicion, and by the belief that only one side could ultimately sit upon the Iron Throne. The dragons still slept. The war had not yet begun, but its shadow was growing larger with every passing year. By now, the children of House Targaryen were growing into adults, and the rivalries that had once existed between their parents were beginning to pass to the next generation. Among them, none would become more feared than Prince Aemond Targaryen. As a child, Aemond often felt different from his brothers and nephews. While many members of his family rode dragons, he had none of his own, and because of this, he was frequently mocked by the other children. The teasing may have seemed small at first, but over time, it left deep scars. Aemond never forgot the humiliation, never forgot the laughter, and never forgot those he blamed for it. Everything changed on the night of Lady Lena Velarion's funeral. Many members of the royal family had gathered on Driftmark. There, Aemond did something few expected. He approached Vhagar, the largest and oldest dragon in the world, a living legend, a dragon that had once carried Vaisnia Targaryen herself. Against all expectations, Aemond succeeded. He claimed Vhagar as his dragon, one of the greatest achievements a young Targaryen could hope for. Yet the victory came at a cost. Soon afterward, a violent fight broke out between Aemond and several of Rhaenyra's children. Insults were exchanged, tempers exploded, and in the chaos, Aemond lost an eye. The injury would remain with him for the rest of his life. But rather than breaking him, it seemed to make him stronger, harder, more determined. Years later, many would remember the words he spoke after losing the eye. He declared that it was a fair trade because he had gained Vhagar. From that day forward, Aemond changed. He trained relentlessly, studied warfare, practiced swordsmanship, and grew into one of the most dangerous warriors in Westeros. Meanwhile, the divide within House Targaryen continued to deepen. Every argument became more serious. Every insult carried greater consequences. The king still lived, and as long as Viserys sat upon the Iron Throne, open conflict could be avoided. But age was catching up with him. His health was steadily declining. The cheerful king who had once dreamed of keeping his family united was becoming weaker with each passing year. And everyone knew what would happen when he was gone. The question that had divided the family for decades would finally need an answer. Would the throne pass to Princess Rhaenyra, the king's chosen heir, or to Prince Aegon, his eldest son? No oath, no promise, and no king would be able to delay that decision forever. The storm that had been building for years was finally approaching. And soon, all of Westeros would feel its fury. As the years went by, King Viserys grew weaker. The burdens of age, illness, and grief had taken their toll. The king, who had once dreamed of peace, now spent much of his time simply trying to hold his family together. But despite his declining health, Viserys never changed his position. Rhaenyra remained his chosen heir, and whenever the question arose, he answered it the same way. The Iron Throne would pass to his daughter. Yet even as the king repeated his wishes, many at court were already preparing for a different future. Supporters of Rhaenyra continued to defend her claim, while supporters of Queen Alicent and Prince Aegon quietly strengthened their own position. The court had become divided into two rival groups, the Blacks and the Greens. What had once been a family disagreement was now becoming a political struggle that reached across the Seven Kingdoms. Then came one of the final gatherings of Viserys' family, a grand dinner held within the Red Keep. For one evening, the king hoped to restore peace. He looked around the table at his children, his grandchildren, and the people he loved most, and he pleaded with them to put aside their differences, to remember that they were family. For a brief moment, it seemed as though his wish might come true. Smiles were exchanged, cups were raised, and laughter returned to the hall. But the peace did not last. Old resentments remained. Old wounds had never healed. And beneath the surface, the rivalry continued to grow. Not long afterward, King Viserys I Targaryen died. His reign, which had lasted for decades, came to an end. The man who had spent his entire life trying to prevent conflict was gone. And with his death, the final barrier between peace and war disappeared. News of the king's death was kept secret at first. Within the Red Keep, important decisions had to be made. The question that had haunted the realm for years could no longer be avoided. Who would sit upon the Iron Throne? Would it be Rhaenyra, the heir chosen by the king himself, or Aegon, the king's eldest son? Both sides believed they were right. Both sides believed the throne belonged to them, and neither side was willing to surrender. The dance of the dragons was no longer a distant possibility. It was about to begin, and before it ended, dragons would fall. Great houses would be destroyed. Thousands would die. And House Targaryen would never be the same again. The death of King Viserys changed everything. For years, his presence alone had prevented the conflict from becoming open war. Now, that protection was gone. Within the Red Keep, a small group of powerful nobles gathered in secret. Among them were Queen Alicent Hightower, Sir Otto Hightower, and several members of the small council. The meeting would later become known as the Green Council. There, a decision had to be made. Some argued that the king's wishes should be respected, that Princess Rhaenyra, his chosen heir, should inherit the Iron Throne. But others disagreed. They believed that Aegon, the king's eldest son, should become king. For years, many of them had quietly prepared for this moment. Plans had been discussed. Allies had been identified. Support had been gathered. The succession crisis that had been building for decades was finally here. As the council continued, the divide between the two sides became impossible to ignore. Yet by the end of the meeting, the decision had been made. Aegon Targaryen would be crowned king. Meanwhile, Princess Rhaenyra remained on Dragonstone, unaware that her father had died, unaware that events were already unfolding without her. Back in King's Landing, the search for Aegon began. Surprisingly, the young prince was not eager to take the throne. He understood the danger that would follow. He knew that accepting the crown could lead to war. Yet powerful figures around him insisted that he had no choice. Eventually, Aegon was found, and preparations for his coronation quickly began. Soon afterward, before a large crowd, Aegon Targaryen was crowned King Aegon II. The conqueror's crown was placed upon his head. The people cheered. Trumpets sounded, and the Greens celebrated their victory. For the first time, they had placed their candidate upon the Iron Throne. But the struggle was far from over, because across the sea, on Dragonstone, another heir still lived. Another claimant still possessed dragons, and another faction was preparing to fight for what it believed was rightfully its own. Then, at last, the news reached Rhaenyra. Her father was dead, and another ruler had already claimed her throne. The princess was devastated, not only by grief, but by betrayal. The kingdom she had been promised for most of her life had been taken from her without warning, without consent, and without a fight. Yet that fight was now coming. Very soon, the 7 kingdoms would be forced to choose sides. Black or green Rhaenyra or Aegon. And once those choices were made, there would be no easy way back. The dance of the dragons had finally begun. When the news reached Dragonstone, Princess Rhaenyra was overwhelmed. She had lost her father. The king who had defended her claim for most of her life was gone. And before she had even been given time to mourn, she learned that her half-brother, Aegon, had already been crowned king in King's Landing. For a time, the weight of these events was almost too much to bear. But grief would soon give way to determination. The throne, Rhaenyra believed, had been promised to her, not by rumor, not by assumption, but by the king himself. Again and again, Viserys had declared that she was his heir, and now she intended to defend that claim. On Dragonstone, her supporters began to gather. Lords arrived from different parts of the realm. Old alliances were renewed. New promises were made, and plans for the future were discussed. Among those standing beside her was Prince Daemon Targaryen, her uncle, her husband, and one of the most experienced warriors in Westeros. Unlike many others, Daemon believed that war was now unavoidable. To him, the Greens had stolen the crown, and he saw little reason to negotiate. Rhaenyra, however, was more cautious. She understood the terrible cost that war could bring. Both sides possessed dragons. Both sides possessed armies, and if conflict began, the entire realm would suffer. For a brief moment, there was still hope that bloodshed might be avoided. Messages were sent. Terms were discussed, and envoys traveled between the rival factions. But trust had already been broken. The wounds ran too deep. Soon afterward, Rhaenyra was crowned on Dragonstone. A crown once worn by her father was placed upon her head, and before her supporters, she was proclaimed Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen. Now, Westeros had two rulers, two monarchs, two courts, and two claims to a single throne. The division that had existed for years was finally complete. The Greens held King's Landing. The Blacks held Dragonstone. And across the 7 kingdoms, lords began deciding which side they would support. Some chose loyalty to the king's final wishes. Others chose tradition. Some followed old alliances. Others followed ambition. Every decision would carry consequences. Every oath could lead to war. Yet despite all the tension, the first great blow had not yet fallen. The dragons had not yet met in battle. The armies had not yet marched. But that fragile peace was about to shatter. Far to the south, a young prince would soon be sent on an important mission. A mission meant to gain allies. A mission that seemed simple, yet it would end in tragedy. And once it was over, there would be no stopping the war that followed. As both sides prepared for war, they understood that dragons alone would not be enough. To win the Iron Throne, they would need allies, powerful houses, strong armies, and the loyalty of the great lords of Westeros. So messages were sent across the realm. Ravens flew from castle to castle. Oaths were remembered. Promises were tested. and every lord was forced to make a choice. On Dragonstone, Queen Rhaenyra assigned important missions to her sons. They would travel to different regions and seek support for the Black cause. One of those sons was Lucerys Velaryon, often called Luke, still young, still growing into adulthood, yet determined to serve his mother. His destination was Storm's End, the seat of House Baratheon, a powerful family whose support could influence the course of the war. Luke mounted his dragon Arax and flew into the skies. The mission seemed straightforward. Deliver the message, request support, then return home. But fate had other plans. When Lucerys arrived at Storm's End, he discovered he was not alone. Another prince had reached the castle before him. Prince Aemon Targaryen, rider of Vihagar, the largest dragon in the world, the same Aemon who had lost an eye years earlier, the same Aemon who had never forgotten the events that had changed his life. Inside the castle, the atmosphere quickly became tense. Old grudges resurfaced. Harsh words were exchanged, and for a moment, it seemed violence might erupt. Yet Lord Boros Baratheon refused to allow bloodshed within his hall. Lucerys was permitted to leave, and he returned to the stormy skies. Had the story ended there, history might have been different, but it did not. Outside Storm's End, dark clouds gathered. Rain fell heavily. Thunder echoed across the sea. And high above, two dragons took flight, Arax and Vihagar. Lucerys attempted to escape, but Vihagar was far larger, far stronger, and far more experienced. What happened next would become one of the most famous and tragic moments of the Dance of the Dragons. The dragons no longer obeyed every command. Fear, instinct, and chaos took control. In the storm, Arax attacked, and Vihagar responded. Within moments, the smaller dragon was torn apart. Lucerys Velaryon fell from the sky and died. He was only a boy. News of his death spread quickly. Across Dragonstone, grief turned to shock. Shock turned to anger. And anger turned into something far darker. Until this moment, many still hoped that the conflict might somehow be contained, that negotiations might still be possible, that peace might yet survive. After the death of Lucerys, those hopes vanished. The first blood of the war had been spilled. A son was dead. A mother mourned, and the desire for vengeance began to grow. When Queen Rhaenyra learned what had happened, she did not speak for a long time. She simply listened. And those who saw her understood immediately that the war had truly begun. The dance of the dragons was no longer a struggle of words, claims, or promises. It had become a war of blood. And blood, once spilled, is rarely forgotten. The death of Lucery's Velaryon sent shockwaves throughout Westeros. For Queen Rhaenyra, the loss was devastating. Luke had not been a soldier. He had not died on a battlefield. He had been her son, a young prince sent on a diplomatic mission. And now he was gone. Those closest to Rhaenyra watched as grief filled Dragonstone. The queen mourned. Her family mourned. And many among the blacks began calling for revenge. Among them was Prince Daemon Targaryen. Unlike Rhaenyra, Daemon's thoughts quickly turned toward retaliation. In his eyes, the Greens had crossed a line. A son of the queen had been killed, and a response was required. Soon afterward, a secret plan began to take shape. One that would become one of the most infamous events in the history of Westeros. Daemon arranged for two men to enter King's Landing. One was a former soldier. The other knew the hidden passages of the Red Keep. Together, they slipped through the castle under cover of darkness. Their target was not a general, not a knight, not even King Aegon himself. Instead, they sought something else, something that would send a message. Deep within the Red Keep, they found Queen Helaena Targaryen and her children. What followed would horrify the realm. The intruders forced Helaena to make an impossible choice, a choice no parent should ever face. And before the night ended, her young son, Prince Jaehaerys, was murdered. The event became known as Blood and Cheese, a name remembered for generations afterward. News of the killing spread rapidly. Across Westeros, people reacted with disbelief. Even among those who supported the blacks, many were disturbed. The death of a child shocked everyone. For Queen Helaena, the tragedy was unbearable. Those around her would later say that she was never truly the same again. And for the Greens, the murder confirmed their fears. If there had been any remaining chance for reconciliation, it was now gone. The war had entered a darker phase. Both sides had suffered losses. Both sides believed themselves to be victims, and both sides now desired vengeance. More armies began to gather. More dragons prepared for battle, and throughout the realm, lords who had hoped to remain neutral found it increasingly difficult to avoid choosing a side. The conflict was growing larger, more dangerous, and more personal. No longer was it simply a dispute over succession. It had become a cycle of grief, revenge, and hatred. A cycle that would continue to claim lives for years to come. And sadly, the worst destruction was still ahead. After the tragedy of blood and cheese, the war spread rapidly across the 7 kingdoms. What had once been a conflict between 2 rival claimants was now becoming a struggle that touched every corner of the realm. Lords who had delayed their decision could wait no longer. One by one, great houses declared their allegiance. Some joined the Blacks, others joined the Greens, and many families found themselves divided, with relatives fighting on opposite sides. Across Westerosi, armies began to march. Castles prepared for sieges. Messengers rode day and night. And everywhere, people wondered what role the dragons would play. For generations, dragons had served as symbols of Targaryen power. Now, for the first time in many years, they would be used against one another. This possibility terrified many. A war between dragons was unlike any conflict the realm had ever seen. Entire armies could be destroyed in moments. Castles could burn. Cities could fall. And every battle risked weakening the very creatures that had built the Targaryen dynasty. Meanwhile, Demon Targaryen continued his campaign for the Blacks. Using both diplomacy and military force, he secured important allies throughout the Riverlands. His reputation as a warrior helped attract support, and his dragon, Caraxes, remained one of the most feared in the world. At the same time, the Greens worked tirelessly to strengthen their own position. King Aegon Roman II sat upon the Iron Throne. His brother, Aemond, served as one of his strongest supporters. And Hagar, the ancient giant among dragons, remained their greatest weapon. Throughout the realm, everyone understood that a direct clash between the dragon riders was becoming inevitable. The tension continued to grow. Yet for a while, both sides avoided committing their most powerful dragons to a decisive battle. The risks were simply too great. Then, in the Crownlands, events began moving toward a confrontation. Small battles erupted. Villages changed hands, and military commanders looked for opportunities to gain an advantage. Every victory seemed important. Every defeat carried consequences. But neither side could yet claim dominance. The war remained uncertain. And as the fighting spread, the cost became increasingly clear. Fields were abandoned. Homes were destroyed. And ordinary people who had no claim to the Iron Throne suffered alongside their rulers. The dance of the dragons had begun as a struggle within one family. Now, the entire realm paying the price. And soon, the war would witness its first truly massive dragon battle. A battle that would shock Westeros. A battle that would prove that even dragons could fall. As the war continued, both the Blacks and the Greens searched for ways to gain an advantage. Neither side could afford a major defeat, and neither side was willing to surrender. Then, attention turned to a strategic castle known as Rook's Rest. Though small compared to many great strongholds, its location made it important. Control of the castle could strengthen influence throughout the region. For the Blacks, it was a valuable position. For the Greens, it was an opportunity. Soon, a plan was put into motion. The Greens launched an attack against Rook's Rest, hoping to force the Blacks to respond. The strategy worked. When word reached the Black leadership, Princess Rhaenys Targaryen decided to act. Known by many as the Queen Who Never Was, Rhaenys was among the most experienced dragon riders alive. She mounted Meleys, the Red Queen, a powerful dragon famous for both speed and strength. And with that, she flew toward battle. At first, it appeared that the Greens had committed only conventional forces. But that was not the whole truth. Waiting nearby were two dragons. Sunfire, ridden by King Aegon Roman II, and Hagar, ridden by Prince Aemond. The trap had been set. What followed became one of the most devastating dragon battles of the entire war. High above the battlefield, the dragons collided. Fire filled the sky. Roars echoed for miles. And below, soldiers watched in disbelief as creatures of legend fought one another. For a time, Rhaenys and Meleys held their ground. Despite being outnumbered, they fought fiercely. But eventually, the odds became overwhelming. Hagar was enormous, the largest dragon alive, and with two opponents against one, the outcome became inevitable. Meleys fell, and with her fell Rhaenys Targaryen, one of the most respected members of House Targaryen. Her death was a tremendous loss for the Blacks. Yet the battle brought consequences for the Greens as well. King Aegon Roman II was badly injured. So badly, in fact, that many feared he might die. His dragon, Sunfire, also suffered terrible wounds. Although the Greens claimed victory, it had come at a heavy cost. The war had now proven something many had feared from the beginning. When dragons fought dragons, there were no true winners. Both sides suffered. Both sides bled. And every battle made House Targaryen weaker. In the aftermath of Rook's Rest, power within the Green faction began to shift. With King Aegon seriously injured, greater responsibility fell upon Prince Aemond, the one-eyed prince who rode Hagar, the prince who had killed Lucerys, and the prince who was becoming one of the most feared men in all of Westeros. As the war continued, Aemond's influence would only grow, and with it, the destruction would grow as well. After the Battle of Rook's Rest, the balance of power within the Green faction began to change. King Aegon Roman II had survived, but his injuries were severe. Much of his body had been burned. His recovery would be slow, and for long periods, he was unable to rule effectively. As a result, more authority fell into the hands of his younger brother, Prince Aemond Targaryen. For years, Aemond had lived in the shadow of others. The second son, the prince who lost an eye, the rider of Hagar. Now, he stood near the center of power, and unlike King Viserys or even King Aegon, Aemond possessed a very different temperament. He was disciplined, proud, intelligent, and often ruthless. Many admired his courage, many feared his judgment, but few doubted his determination. As acting leader of the Green War effort, Aemond sought to break the strength of the Blacks. He believed that decisive action could end the conflict, and with Hagar at his command, he possessed the most powerful weapon in the war. Meanwhile, the Blacks continued to struggle with their own losses. The death of Rhaenys had been a devastating blow, and yet Queen Rhaenyra refused to surrender. More allies joined her cause, more armies gathered, and across the realm, the fighting continued. The Riverlands, in particular, became one of the war's most dangerous regions. Armies marched through towns and villages. Castles changed hands, and ordinary people found themselves trapped between rival forces. Then, Aemond made a decision that would further shape his reputation. Rather than remaining close to King's Landing, he took Hagar and moved deeper into enemy territory. His goal was to weaken the Black supporters throughout the Riverlands. Wherever he went, his presence inspired fear. Entire settlements could see Hagar from miles away. The dragon's shadow alone was enough to send people running. Yet, despite all his strength, Aemond faced a difficult problem. Hagar was powerful, but one dragon, no matter how mighty, could not be everywhere. The war continued to spread. New fronts emerged, and the Blacks still possessed many dragon riders of their own. As the months passed, both sides began searching for new advantages, new strategies, new allies, and most importantly, new dragon riders, because because many dragons still remained without riders. Ancient creatures living on Dragonstone, wild, powerful, and largely unused. Soon, an extraordinary idea would emerge. An idea that could dramatically increase the strength of the Blacks. An idea that would bring new dragon riders into the war. And in doing so, change the course of the dance of the dragons forever. As the war dragged on, Queen Rhaenyra and her supporters faced a difficult reality. While the Blacks still possessed many dragons, not all of them had riders. Some remained on Dragonstone, powerful creatures without anyone to command them. It was a remarkable advantage, but only if it could be used. The question was simple: who could ride them? The answer, however, was far more complicated. For generations, the ability to bond with dragons had been closely associated with the blood of old Valyria. And while the Targaryens were the most famous Valyrian family, they were not the only people with such ancestry. Across Westeros, there existed individuals whose family lines contained traces of Valyrian blood. Many lived ordinary lives. Few imagined they might one day be called upon to ride dragons. Yet that is exactly what happened. The Blacks announced that anyone with possible Valyrian ancestry could attempt to claim a dragon. The risk was enormous. Dragons were not horses. They could not simply be mounted and controlled. Many who approached them were rejected. Some fled in terror. Others paid with their lives. Yet a handful succeeded. These individuals became known as the Dragon Seeds, common-born riders who suddenly found themselves commanding some of the most powerful creatures in the world. Among them were men who would become famous throughout the war. Hugh Hammer, Ulf White, Adam of Hull, and several others. One by one, new riders claimed dragons, and with each success, the military strength of the Blacks increased. For a time, the strategy appeared brilliant. Rhaenyra now possessed more dragon riders than before, more opportunities, more weapons, and perhaps a better chance of victory. Yet there was a hidden danger. Loyalty cannot always be guaranteed, especially during war. Some of the new riders had not been raised within House Targaryen. They had not grown up surrounded by royal duty. Many had their own ambitions, their own desires, and their own visions for the future. At first, those concerns seemed distant. The immediate goal was survival. The war continued, and every dragon was valuable. Meanwhile, the conflict across Westeros grew even more destructive. Battles erupted across multiple regions. armies marched, castles burned, and the cost of the war continued to rise. Yet amid all this chaos, an important opportunity was beginning to appear. The Greens were facing difficulties of their own. King Egon Roman II remained weakened. Resources were stretched, and tensions within the capital were growing. The Blacks recognized the moment, a chance to strike directly at the heart of their enemies, a chance to seize King's Landing itself. And if they succeeded, the course of the war could change forever. As the war continued, the balance of power began to shift. For months, the Greens had controlled King's Landing, the capital of the Seven Kingdoms, the seat of the Iron Throne. But maintaining control was becoming more difficult. King Egon Roman II remained badly injured. Political tensions were growing. Resources were strained, and uncertainty spread throughout the city. The Blacks recognized an opportunity. If they could capture King's Landing, they would gain more than a city. They would gain the symbol of royal authority, the very heart of the realm. Plans were made. Allies were contacted. And before long, events began moving with surprising speed. Faced with the approaching threat, many Green leaders chose to withdraw. Rather than risk being trapped, they abandoned the city. When Black forces arrived, they encountered far less resistance than expected. And so, King's Landing fell. For the first time during the war, Queen Rhaenyra entered the capital as its ruler. The moment seemed historic. For years, she had fought for her claim. Now, at last, she sat upon the Iron Throne. The goal she had pursued for much of her life appeared to have been achieved. Yet victory can sometimes create new problems. Ruling a kingdom is very different from winning a war. The city Rhaenyra inherited was struggling. The treasury had been depleted. Food supplies were limited. Fear and uncertainty filled the streets, and many citizens had grown weary of conflict. The Queen soon discovered that governing during wartime was far more difficult than she had imagined. To fund her administration and military efforts, new taxes became necessary. These measures were unpopular. Resentment began to spread. Meanwhile, the war itself continued. The Greens had not been defeated. Their armies remained active. Their supporters remained loyal. And dangerous enemies still moved throughout the realm. Among them, none inspired more fear than Aemond Targaryen. While Rhaenyra occupied King's Landing, Aemond and Hagar continued their campaign. The conflict showed no signs of ending. In fact, many of the war's most destructive events were still ahead. Within the capital, the pressure upon Rhaenyra continued to grow. Every setback weakened confidence. Every rumor created new tensions. And slowly, the triumph of capturing the Iron Throne began to fade. The Queen had won the city, but winning the city was not the same thing as winning the war. Soon, those cracks would widen. Trust would weaken. Allies would begin to question one another. And the fortunes of Queen Rhaenyra would begin to change. The road that had brought her to the Iron Throne had been difficult. The road ahead would be even harder. At first, Queen Rhaenyra believed that capturing King's Landing would bring her closer to victory. After all, she now sat upon the Iron Throne. The capital was under her control, and many of her enemies had been driven away. Yet, as the weeks passed, it became clear that the war was far from over. The kingdom remained divided. Armies still marched. Dragons still flew. And every victory seemed to create new challenges. Within King's Landing, conditions continued to worsen. Food became scarce. Prices increased. And ordinary citizens grew frustrated. Many blamed the war. Others blamed those who ruled the city. Rumors spread quickly. Whispers filled the markets, the taverns, and the crowded streets. Confidence in the Queen began to weaken. At the same time, Rhaenyra faced difficulties within her own faction. The losses of war had been severe. Several trusted allies were dead. Others questioned important decisions, and maintaining unity was becoming harder with each passing month. Then came another blow. Daemon Targaryen, one of the strongest figures supporting the Blacks, was increasingly occupied with the fighting elsewhere. The war had spread across the realm, and many battles were occurring far from the capital. The Queen often found herself isolated, burdened, and under enormous pressure. Meanwhile, the dragon seeds, who had once appeared to be a great advantage, began to create uncertainty. Some remained loyal. Others became unpredictable. The dangers that had once seemed distant were now becoming real. Trust, already fragile, continued to erode. Across Westeros, the conflict showed no sign of ending. Entire regions had been devastated. Thousands had died. And still, neither side was willing to surrender. The dream of a quick victory had vanished. Then, events within King's Landing took an even darker turn. The people were exhausted, hungry, fearful, and increasingly angry. Crowds gathered. Unrest spread. the authority of the crown began to weaken. What started as frustration slowly transformed into open resistance. For Queen Rhaenyra, this was a nightmare. She had fought for years to claim the Iron Throne. Yet now, while sitting upon it, she found herself losing the support of many people she ruled. The city that had welcomed her was becoming hostile, and the foundations of her rule were beginning to crack. The war had already taken dragons, princes, queens, and countless soldiers. Soon, it would take something else. The confidence that Rhaenyra could hold the realm together, and once that confidence began to disappear, the fall would come quickly. As Queen Rhaenyra's position continued to weaken, the war entered one of its most chaotic and destructive phases. Across the realm, loyalties shifted. Old alliances broke apart, and the confidence that many once had in either side began to disappear. Nowhere was this more dangerous than among the dragon seeds, the riders who had once strengthened the black cause. For a time, their dragons had given Rhaenyra a powerful advantage, but war has a way of changing people, and power often creates new ambitions. Some dragon seeds began to question why they should risk their lives for someone else's crown. Others dreamed of greater rewards, greater influence, or perhaps something more. Then came one of the greatest betrayals of the war. During the fighting near Tumbleton, two of the most powerful dragon seeds changed sides. Hugh Hammer and Ulf White, men who had once fought for the Blacks, now joined the Greens. The consequences were enormous. Not only had Rhaenyra lost valuable allies, but her enemies had gained dragons. The balance of power shifted once again. Trust collapsed. Fear spread. And throughout the Black faction, many wondered who might betray them next. The First Battle of Tumbleton became one of the bloodiest events of the war. The town suffered greatly. Soldiers died by the thousands. Buildings burned, and dragons once again filled the skies with fire. By now, the conflict had become something far worse than a struggle for succession. It was destroying the very kingdom both sides claimed they wished to rule. Meanwhile, King's Landing continued to descend into disorder. The people were exhausted. Years of war, hunger, and uncertainty had taken their toll. Anger grew, rumors multiplied, and public unrest became increasingly difficult to control. Then came one of the most shocking moments in the history of the city. A massive uprising erupted. Crowds flooded the streets. Violence spread rapidly. And in the chaos, the people turned against the dragons themselves. What followed became known as the storming of the dragon pit. Several dragons were attacked and killed, some by overwhelming numbers, others while trapped inside the structure. The destruction was horrifying. For generations, dragons had symbolized the power of House Targaryen. Now, ordinary people were helping to destroy them. When news spread across the realm, many could hardly believe it. Yet it was true. The age of dragons was beginning to come to an end. For Rhaenyra, the situation had become desperate. Her allies were abandoning her. The capital was slipping from her control. And the creatures that had once guaranteed Targaryen supremacy were dying. The queen who had finally claimed the Iron Throne was now fighting simply to survive. And soon, she would be forced to leave the very city she had worked so hard to win. The war was approaching its final chapters. But before it ended, one final tragedy still awaited House Targaryen. After the fall of King's Landing, Queen Rhaenyra was no longer the ruler she had once hoped to become. The city had turned against her. Her supporters had grown fewer, and many of the dragons that once symbolized the strength of House Targaryen were gone. Exhausted, grieving, and surrounded by uncertainty, Rhaenyra fled the capital with the few allies who remained loyal. She still believed that the war could somehow be won, that somewhere within the realm, there were still those who would fight for her claim. But the years of conflict had changed everything. The kingdom was tired. Its people were starving. Its armies were weakened. And death had visited nearly every great house. Meanwhile, another tragedy had already shaken the Blacks. Prince Daemon Targaryen, the warrior who had stood beside Rhaenyra through so much, had faced Aemond Targaryen above the god's eye, mounted upon their dragons, Caraxes and Vhagar. The two princes met in one of the most legendary duels in the history of Westeros. When the battle ended, both dragons fell into the waters below, and neither Daemon nor Aemond was ever seen alive again. Their deaths removed two of the greatest warriors of their generation, and left the war without its most feared rivals. Still, Rhaenyra pressed on, until fate brought her to Dragonstone, the island that had once been her home, the place where she had been crowned, the place where she believed she would find safety. But Dragonstone was no longer secure. Unknown to the Queen, forces loyal to King Aegon Roman II had already regained control. And waiting there was her half-brother, King Aegon, the man against whom she had fought for years, the man she believed had stolen her crown. Captured and helpless, Rhaenyra stood before her enemy, and with her was her young son, Aegon, the boy who would one day become king. What happened next would become one of the darkest moments in the history of House Targaryen. Before the eyes of her son, Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen was executed by Sunfire, the dragon of King Aegon Roman II. Thus ended the life of the woman who had spent most of her life believing that the Iron Throne was hers by right. She died not upon the throne, but as a prisoner, and her son, forced to witness the horror, would carry that memory for the rest of his days. Yet, despite Rhaenyra's death, the war was not over, because even now, the kingdom remained divided. And though Aegon Roman II had survived, victory would bring him little peace. For House Targaryen, the suffering was not yet at an end, and the scars left by the dance of the dragons would remain for generations to come. Although Queen Rhaenyra was dead, the war did not end immediately. Too much blood had already been spilled. Too many oaths had been sworn, and too many families had suffered losses to simply lay down their swords. King Aegon Roman II had outlived his rival, but survival was not the same as victory. Years of war had left him broken. His body still carried the wounds he had suffered at Rook's Rest. His dragon, Sunfire, was dead. His family had been devastated, and the kingdom he ruled was exhausted. Across Westeros, many lords continued to support Rhaenyra's son, young Aegon, the boy who had witnessed his mother's death. The boy who was now known as Aegon the Younger. Armies loyal to the Blacks continued to advance, and with each passing day, the position of King Aegon Roman II became weaker. More and more people began to understand that the war could not continue forever. The realm needed peace. It needed healing. And above all, it needed an end. But before that peace could come, another death would change everything. One morning, King Aegon Roman II was found dead, poisoned. Even today, no one knows with certainty who was responsible. Some blamed his enemies. Others suspected his own supporters. Perhaps those closest to him simply wished to end the suffering before the kingdom destroyed itself completely. Whatever the truth, the war had finally reached its conclusion. Neither side had truly won. Neither side had achieved everything it desired. Instead, House Targaryen had nearly destroyed itself. In the aftermath, young Aegon, the son of Rhaenyra, was crowned king. He became Aegon III, still a child, still carrying memories no child should ever possess. He had seen war. He had seen betrayal, and he had witnessed the death of his own mother. those experiences would remain with him for the rest of his life. Under his reign, peace slowly returned, but something important had changed forever. Most of the dragons were gone. The mighty creatures that had helped build the Targaryen dynasty had nearly vanished. The skies that had once belonged to dragons were becoming silent, and with them, an age was coming to an end. The dance of the dragons had lasted only a few years, but its consequences would echo for centuries. And House Targaryen, though still alive, would never again reach the same heights it had once known. And so, the dance of the dragons came to an end. Not with celebration, not with triumph, and not with heroes returning home, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows years of sorrow, years of fire, years of loss. When the war began, both sides believed they were fighting for justice, for duty, for their families, and for the Iron Throne. Yet in the end, the throne remained. But so many others did not. Kings were gone. Queens were gone. Princes, princesses, lords, knights, and dragons. So many dragons. The creatures that had carried House Targaryen to greatness had nearly disappeared. And with them, an age was fading away. Young Aegon III would rule the realm. Peace would slowly return. Children would grow. Seasons would pass, and life, as it always does, would continue. But the scars left by the war would never fully heal. For generations, people would remember the dance of the dragons, not as a tale of glory, but as a warning, a reminder that even the most powerful families can destroy themselves. That pride can be more dangerous than any enemy, and that sometimes the greatest threat does not come from beyond the walls, but from within. Centuries later, House Targaryen would continue to rule. New kings would come, old kings would die, and eventually their dynasty itself would fall. Yet the memory of dragons, fire, and blood would never truly disappear. And far in the future, another Targaryen girl would one day look into the flames and dream of bringing dragons back into the world. But that is another story. For now, our journey together has reached its end. Thank you, my dear listener, for joining me tonight. I hope you've enjoyed our quiet journey through the history of House of the Dragon. And wherever you are, I hope you are warm. I hope you are comfortable. And I hope that sleep finds you gently. Good night, my dear listener. And until next time, sleep well. And so, our journey through the history of House of the Dragon comes to an end. Thank you, my dear listener, for spending this quiet evening with me. I hope you've enjoyed our journey through kings and queens, dragons and battles, victories and tragedies. And now, as our story fades into the night, I hope you can leave behind the worries of the day. Allow your thoughts to slow. Allow your body to rest. And let sleep find you gently. If you enjoyed tonight's story, perhaps we'll meet again for another quiet journey through history. But for now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and simply rest. Good night, my dear listener, and until next time, sleep well.